All right, everybody, it's the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get this North Central Climate Collaborative webinar for February started. To give a few logistical details, we are recording this session today, and hopefully within a week or so after this, the recording will be available on our website at northcentralclimate.org. We do have the ability to unmute. We do not have the ability for anyone to unmute due to the size of the audience today. So we do have the chat feature enabled. Please do use that to share any questions that you might have along the way, and we will certainly hope to get to as many of those at the end of the presentation as we can. I also want to share that there are going to be a couple poll questions that will open up as soon as Stuart's presentation is closing as we get into the questions period. So don't be surprised when you see those poll questions pop up, and I will announce it when that happens. So with that, we have Stuart Carlton here to present today. He is with the Indiana-Illinois Sea Grant. He has got a topic that I'm pretty excited about as far as the communication of climate, and with that, outreach and social sciences. Great. So go ahead and take it away, Stuart.
I will. Can y'all hear me okay?
Sounds great to me.
I made the mistake of changing a setting. Never change a setting once you have it working, but I changed the setting. Okay. Hey, thank you everybody so much for joining in here. Now, I'm going to admit some ignorance in case it's not painfully obvious from when I start talking. Before I do it, and I don't know a ton about this collaborative, so what I'd like to do to start is this will definitely work with 152 people online and counting. If you could paste in what it is you do in a like 3 words or less related to climate into the chat, everybody at once, it'll be beautiful, and we'll see it by. So I want to know who I'm talking to. So that I can try to target what I do. So we'll do that now, and I will read them out periodically. Climate specialist, I see. Ag carbon mitigation. SciComm, hashtag. Good. Drinking water protection. I just saw drinking fly by, and I was like, oh, let's wait till the end of the talk. Good. Water quality standards, ag conservation. Lead behavioral scientist. Oh, that's intense. Good. Oh, someone who's higher up than me on the Sea Grant org chart. Didn't know that would happen. All right, fantastic. Thank you for pasting all of this in. So let me give a little background on myself, and keep pasting if you haven't. I love seeing all this. Please do. So I am a natural resources social scientist. I'm at Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, and I'm a research assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources over here at Purdue. And a good chunk of my early work was on climate change research. I did a postdoc with Linda Prokopi here in the department. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that work in addition to some other things. And then since then, I've been working with Sea Grant for the last 5 years here, and then 4 years before that at Texas Sea Grant. And the research side is dialed off a little bit, but the real life experience side has sort of increased. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So it's going to be kind of really all over the place. Hopefully it will work. If it doesn't work, then you will say that didn't work, and we will all go home and say at least we gave it the old college try. But I think it's going to work well. But it'll be a little bit broad ranging. And so if I leave something or I accidentally speak about something and you want me to repeat it, or I don't know what I said, just chime on in. Okay, integrating climate change and research and outreach in the Midwest, lessons from the social sciences. That's what I have chosen apparently to call this. So let's do it. First, we have the parade of logos. My lab group is the Coastal and Great Lakes Social Science Lab. We're a small lab group on purpose because I do have significant administrative duties, but we do a lot of great work on sort of complex natural resources issues in the coastal and Great Lakes areas. I want to acknowledge all of these people. The Purdue Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. I'm from New Orleans, so I've changed the logo a little bit. And of course, USDA, NSF funding. There's been NOAA funding. They're represented through Sea Grant and things like this. Citizen scientist. Welcome, Anne. All right, let's see. I'm going to click this meta webinar stuff. So some of this I've already done, right? But this is in ancient Greece, and I'm not like a super wise philosopher. So I don't want to just be speaking to you. So even though you can't, or lecturing to you. So even though you can't unmute yourself, because that would just be chaos. If you have some questions or comments, please paste them in the chat, right? One of the things I do every other month is I run something for our program we call Ask Dr. Fish, which is like a live stream in which we, people ask questions of a couple of fish biologists that we have on Sea Grant staff, and it's really fun. And so if you have questions, I probably can't answer them, but maybe I can, or maybe we can talk about it. So please chime in, because the hypodermic method of me injecting knowledge into you, it doesn't work for me, because I start to fall asleep. And so if it doesn't work for you either, that's okay. Let's facilitate this. All right. Yeah, so feel free to speak up, or in this case, chat up if you will, and there will be time at the end as well. So let's make sure we use that time to the extent possible to try to learn together. Because like I say, I don't have a particular amount of wisdom about this, and I just have a little bit of knowledge that I like to share. So if you have any unanswered questions, my email is relatively straightforward. It's jsc@purdue.edu. That's for Joshua Stuart Carlton, but please call me Stuart. And many of the citations are up at my website, jscarlton.net/publications, but I haven't updated that since I got my latest job. So some of those might be out of date, because you update your website when you're looking for a job, and then some people keep it updated, the rest of us do our job. So I'm going to attempt to summarize 15 years of climate resilience research and outreach in about 27.5 minutes. Will I succeed? Who knows? Let's find out. So what I'm going to do in case I don't succeed is the three things I sort of want you to take home from this, that I'm going to mention these conclusions at the outset, and then we'll talk about them a little bit, and then how I arrived at these conclusions. I'll show some of my research. There's of course tons of research on this, but I'll show some of my research and experience that leads me to draw these big conclusions, and then we'll have the grand finish and go home happy. All right, so the first of the big conclusions is this: there are a diversity of viewpoints on climate change, right? And so that's important to remember. And there's, stuff you can do about that through communication and education, but you're not going to stop a diversity of opinions, I think, going on. The other thing is these views are relatively resistant to change, at least in the short run, right? It's hard to change people's minds, frankly, especially about things that can be as deep-seated as climate change. It's hard to do that. And so that's worth keeping in mind. And that's sort of the second of these three big conclusions. And the third one is one approach is to work with people's beliefs, not against them, right? And this is not news to all of you, but I think it's always important to talk about. It's always important to talk about sort of what the research shows with that. So I can talk about these three. There's actually a fourth conclusion, but I will get that later. Great. So one is there's a diversity of viewpoints on climate change. Now, what I mean by this, in specific, at least as it pertains to my research, is that many people still do not accept the scientific consensus on climate change. Okay. So here is the scientific consensus as put in one of these goofy waffle graphs. I made this to learn how to make waffle graphs, but this is about 10 studies on climate change. It's different ways of surveying scientists, and a lot of different things were done. Like Naomi Oreskes in 2004, this was like the first big study of scientists. She found, and her team found, that 100% of scientists believe that human-caused climate change is happening, and that number might be a little high. But like when you look at it, all of these different studies were done in different ways, including one by me, of course, in 2015 with Linda Prokopi and some other people here at Purdue. But they all find a very strong consensus. And I don't have the slide up here, but what we found in our work is that there's a really strong consensus across fields, right? We wondered, do physicists not believe in climate change because they have the one true knowledge? And they think you can't model things because you can only measure them or express them through, mathematical beauty or whatever. And the answer is no, physicists believe in climate change. Do chemists think, they have more knowledge than we do? So maybe no, chemists believe in climate change too. The field actually with the lowest belief in climate change, at least back in 2014, this is 8 years later, right? So it may have changed, and I'm sure it has changed, was natural resources. But even then it was in the mid to upper 80s. And so, we found out, we just asked people, incidentally, if you're wondering how did we find that out, we just asked them. And so, there's a broad scientific consensus about climate change. But, sorry, I was supposed to grow it up so you could actually see these cool little waffle things. So anyway, here are the cool little waffle graphs. I think I already kind of went over it too. The blue is the climate change believers, and the gray are the climate change doubters. Almost all scientists are believers. Now, you can question, what is the point of scientific consensus? Is that something we should really be studying? And I think that's a fair point to raise. It's not a conversation we're going to have right now. Yeah, this is a good look at this. Sadie Newman just asked the question. So now we are going to have this. Is there a reason why we still say scientists believe when we're talking about consensus? Sadie, so I actually hear a couple of different questions in there. One is related to what is this notion of belief? I hear a lot of pushback that I hear is, well, why can you say people believe things? Especially if it's things that we know to be true, right? Or that we believe or understand to be true through a scientific process. Is believe even the right term? That's the first question I hear. And then the second question I hear is like, what is the value in studying consensus? And I have a couple thoughts on those. And so the first is when it comes to beliefs, belief has sort of a few different ways to define it. And so when I say belief, I'm thinking in kind of a social scientific term, like a belief is something that somebody holds to be true. Or it's a reflection of somebody's understanding of society. And so I think it is fair from a social science standpoint to say that I believe something to be true because it reflects my understanding of the world. Now, when you're talking about, a scientific process that has undergone many different people have studied this from many different ways, and they pretty consistently arrive at this conclusion, then sort of the common idea of belief, this thing is like something I think is true, but I don't know is true, or, I believe in gravity. Does that make sense? I hear your point, but to me, when I say beliefs, I mean, it is something that the way that somebody understands the universe. And so that's my thought when it comes to beliefs. So when we're talking about consensus, what is the value in studying consensus? To me, I'm not going to lie, I think it's a little bit limited. I think it's important, right, to recognize that there are legitimate debates about climate change. There are debates about the extent to which different factors play in it. I'm not qualified to engage in those debates. There are legitimate debates about what the role of society now should be in preparing for future generations, right? How much value is adaptation or mitigation now versus later? How much do we owe future generations? How much pain should we suffer, right, for those who are coming later? And I think those are important debates. All of those debates are important, but those often are lost in this debate over consensus. And I actually sort of I moved away from this sort of research for that exact purpose, as I think that there are more important questions out there. But I think it is important to establish as bedrock that the existence of human-caused climate change is not controversial. It is not controversial among scientists, and given that there's a lot of shall we say, motivated reasoning out there trying to, I don't like to get in these terms like deniers and not denying. I think that actually is not helpful a lot of times. But since there is a lot of people who are actively working to spread denial out there, I think it's important to establish that. Does that work for you, Sadie, or do you have a follow-up there? That's a thank you and a smiley. We'll take it. Okay. Oh, look at that. I'm supposed to blow that. You think I'd remember. So this, I'll just blow it up here. So a guy named Peter Howe at Yale a couple of years ago established this method for using various surveys and demographics to kind of roughly estimate belief in climate change across different places. Now, these are not, don't take these as like being the absolute God's truth, right? But these are rough estimates of climate change beliefs across the different states. And you can go to that website that I printed down there, and you can click on it and you can look by county, I think by census tract or city or something like that. And so, if this were just scientists, the percent who think global warming is happening would be, the very dark maroon, or maybe it's a brown or whatever it is, right there near 100%. And here you see these maps are way redder than they were when I first started giving versions of this talk back in 2015, back when they first came out. There was a lot more blue. Right now, most adults think that global warming is happening. That's a big change. That's a big change. So it's most people, which I find to be both comforting and disquieting, because I think the reason they believe is the effects are getting harder to deny. But I'm glad that at least we can establish like a base viewpoint here. This next one, okay, I'll call that out in just a moment, Scott. This next one is a percent of adults who think that global warming is mostly human caused. Look how much whiter it is, right? Or how much a lighter color that is. So fewer people believe that it's mostly human caused than belief in that it's actually happening. And Scott points out that this Yale climate communication webpage has answers to a bunch of policy related questions as well. And he says it's super useful. I agree. It is super useful. They're doing really good work there. So yay for them. So going back, this is what I'm talking about when I say there's a diversity of viewpoints on climate change. And this is just within, is it existing, right? When you break out all of those sub-questions I talked about in response to Sadie's brilliant question, when you break out all those sub-things, all of a sudden the diversity just expands, a million points, right? What should we do? Well, there's going to be a diversity of opinions on that. And so, we maybe are starting to agree on just the basic fact of climate change's existence, but that's just part of the party. And I know you know this because you're out there in the field, right? You're a citizen scientist, you're in resource management, you're working with people, in science communication or as, healthy soils. Those are good, right? You're raising a child. Oh, Valerie, you know about a diversity of opinions, right? But it's really important to remember that. And this leads into our next point, which is that these opinions are relatively resistant, to change, at least in the short run. So let's see what do I have to say about that. Hmm. Here's why I'm going to talk about the useful to usable project. Y'all may have heard about this before. It's not like Linda under promoted this. Not that I blame her. It's really good work. So I'm going to give, and I know J.R. Buckler, I saw J.R. Buckle's name shoot by, and I know he knows about this project. But I'm going to give a brief overview of just my little corner of this woods. So Useful to Usable is a project. It's now, woo, baby, about 10 years ago this started. And it was this woman, Linda Prokope is her name. She's now the department head in the Horticulture and Landscape Architecture department here at Purdue. But she was my postdoc mentor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And she got a bunch of USDA money to bring together state climatologists, crop modelers, agronomists, economists, social scientists like Linda and I, regional center staff, all together on this idea of how can we help farmers integrate climate information into their farm management practice. Which is kind of a key and important question, right? And so this was a really impressive study. Linda is very good at bringing together these huge, diverse teams to answer big questions. She is courageous and big picture oriented and all of this stuff, whereas I'm a total coward and very small picture oriented, but that's okay. And so this is the study region, and so Linda's work is great. You can find it, but the part that I was looking at was in this sort of narrow study region, or it was in the study region, but a narrow part of it. And so that is right before I started. They surveyed thousands of farmers, farm advisors about climate change beliefs and adaptation attitudes. So if you don't work in ag, which some of you don't, farm advisors, what those are basically is there's this huge industry in the Midwest of people whose job it is to advise farmers on how to do farming. And I didn't know this existed. I came from New Orleans, right? I didn't even know you didn't eat all this corn. Well, you do, but you do it indirectly through like pigs or whatever. So these farm advisors, their job, oftentimes they work for the seed companies, but not always. There's also private consultants and things like that. And they advise farmers on what to do. And so we surveyed them, we surveyed the farmers about their climate change beliefs. In fact, look at that, Jay, there's your name. And this is, I should have updated this graph with some measures of dispersion. There should be a confidence interval here, but there isn't. And we found that advisors back in 10 years ago were much more likely to believe that climate change is occurring and that it was human caused than were farmers themselves. So here again is that diversity of opinion. But this was sort of our baseline data that we set. And so we did this study and found some baseline data about how people felt related to climate change. And then what happened? How many of y'all were around here in 2013? Oh, I'd like to see. Hey, so Carrie Radloff, I don't know what Carrie you do, but this is a great question. She wants to see a map of I believe humans can reduce climate change. They who may not think it's caused by humans may still think we have the power to slow it down. That's an interesting question. And I appreciate that comment, Carrie. Thank you for that. Anyway, so this study was taken right before I was born, and this is like our baseline data. Okay, cool. And then, if you recall, in 2012 and 13, we had a real bad drought, the worst drought in 50 or more years, right? Do y'all remember this? You probably do. I was here for like the tail end of it, I guess. It was nasty though. Like the yields were down. The way you measure drought in farm country is you look at your yields, right? And so the yields were down to the lowest. I think it was something like 50 or 75%, the lowest they had been since 2000 or since the 90s. Which, given the improvements in seed technology, having your yields down that much is hugely important. Look at all these dramatic pictures. I mean, that's gross, right? That's not how that land is supposed to look. And so it's a real problem. And so what we did, we asked these people about their climate change beliefs, but then we also had this huge drought. So this is kind of a natural experiment, right? Or is what we ended up calling it was a natural, we call it a quasi-natural pseudo experiment, something like that. Oh yeah, hey, Valerie points out it was really horrible danger in Colorado too. Smoky air all summer, right, with the wildfires and things like that. My orientation here was about the farming and the lost crops, most of which were buffered by crop insurance, but there were still lost crops, and nobody likes that. But there's a lot of danger associated with this drought too. And so we treated this as a natural quasi-experiment, or whatever we ended up calling it. I can't remember, and it's been a while since I've taken experimental design. And we resurveyed these people and said, hey, did your climate change beliefs change? And so here, I'm going to have the big dramatic reveal. Look at this. All right. Oh, this is kind of hokey, but here we are. All right. Before the drought, about 36.8% of people thought that climate change was occurring and was roughly equally human and naturally caused. About 26.4 believe there was insufficient evidence to know if climate change was happening or not. About 23%, I don't need to read the decimal points, but about 23% thought that it was occurring and naturally caused. About 12% thought it was occurring in human cause, and 2% thought that it was not occurring at all. So that's kind of where that was. Now, when I'm doing this big dramatic reveal, I made the mistake of letting the slopes of those lines appear. So I apologize for ruining the secret here. But look at this as it zooms out. There was no change, people. I mean, just minimal change after the drought. So we asked them after the drought. A gain of about 1% said that it was equally occurring in equally human and natural causes. About 2.5% fewer people said that there was insufficient evidence. That's where the big change was, and it was 2.5%. Basically no change in what the people thought it was occurring and naturally caused. No change in occurring in human cause, and basically no change in it was not occurring. So just not a big shift after this drought at all. So this was a very significant event, and there just wasn't a change in climate change beliefs. We also looked at adaptation attitudes. I'll show you these cool beam plots. So you're going to interpret the top of these and the bottom of these differently. These are sort of estimates of the distribution of the responses. The light gray, which is on top, is after the drought. The dark gray, which is on bottom, is before the drought. Each line is kind of our individual responses, and you see them all kind of stacked in on each other. I jittered them a little bit so you could see them. And then the orange is the average, right? The orange is the average. So the average adaptation attitude, this were things like, can people adapt? Are they excited? Do they think they can adapt or whatever? That did not change before and after the drought. Results to other questions we asked them, like, I would like to provide advice. This was for farm advisors. I would like to provide advice based on climate forecasts. That did not change before and after the drought. The results for farmers should take additional steps to protect farmland from increased weather. I cut that off there, but it's like increased effects of climate and weather. Look at that one actually changed, and a significant change. It went from like a 3.75 to like 3.8 something, right? So it changed significantly, but boy, it's not a lot of change still. This is farm advisors again. In my role as an advisor, I should help farmers prepare for increased weather variability. No change there. And I'm going to speed through these because it's just a bunch of not change, right? A bunch of no change. And so the point is that these views, I was saying, views are relatively resistant to change, at least in the short run. Now, this is old research. But in my experience out there, there's other research that's come out that's shown kind of the same thing, that people's views are shifting, but it's taken a decade of of hurricanes and weather and stuff that may or may not be directly attributable to climate change, but that are nasty climate related effects. And then people starting to change their opinion, but it's taken that long. And it's not just within climate that people's views don't change, right? Anything that is controversial, anything that is value based, which climate change beliefs can be, especially if you look at like the cultural cognition theory and stuff like that, we won't have time to get into, but I can talk to you about it some other point if you want. People are going to be resistant to change that. People are resistant to change, the way that they feel. And so that hasn't changed. And so that takes me to our third point that I want to make, our third big conclusion, really 3 points, I guess, which is this. And that is, one approach is to work with people's beliefs rather than against them, right? Because I would posit that those first two things are things about humans that we're not going to change. We're not going to change that people have diverse beliefs. We're not going to change that people's beliefs are resistant to change. So you can pout about that, which I like doing. I'm a big pouter. I too have kids. There's a lot of pouting that happens in our house. But I think another thing to do is the more positive approach is to work with that. And that's very easy to say and very hard to do. But for those of you who are working in the climate field, you know this. This is what your job is, right? This is what your job is. And so one way I like to think about that is that people tend to understand things that are more salient to them. And I've got a couple ways I want to talk about this. One is, this actually came out of my dissertation. This is a paper I wrote a while ago in environmental communication, using expert and non-expert models of climate change to enhance communication. Now with ChatGPT, you just type in enhance and it does it, but this is what we used to have to do. So this took place in Crystal River, Florida. Give me a thumb up in the chat if you've been to Crystal River or Citrus County, Florida, on the west coast there. So this is on the Panhandle. There it is in red. I don't know why Lake Okeechobee is in purple in this map. I mean, the main reason is I am no good at GIS. That is the reason, but Lake Okeechobee is purple. We're focused in the red area, which is right outside of Gainesville. Look at all these thumbs up. All right. So well, here's what people know about Crystal River, Florida. Here's what I know about it anyway. And that is there's a wildlife refuge right over there. Well, I'm getting to that, Tanya. Yeah. And great. Valley worked with UF Extension. Fantastic. There's a decent restaurant, one decent restaurant, and there's a nuclear power plant that has since been decommissioned. That's one thing that people know about Crystal River. The main thing they know is just this: there's this unbelievably clear and beautiful water there, right? And it is one of the few places where you can go and legally harass an endangered species. You can snorkel with the manatees there. You're really not supposed to harass them; it is illegal. But they do have all sorts of trips. This was actually a really bad year for manatees in terms of deaths. So that is sad, but it's really cool to see them, right? And it's really cool to do the snorkeling. So I get why people like it. Oh, look at that. There's somebody that could be you, Tanya. I don't know who took this. Carl Vallo at Flickr took this. So if you know Carl Vallo, that could be you. But it's super fun. Manatees are really cool. And so we asked about mental models. So what is a mental model? I should put my head there instead. Oh, well. A mental model is basically somebody's conception of how the world works, right? Your mental model for how something works. And it's based on your beliefs and your experiences and whatever. And we decided we wanted to ask people, we wanted to ask specifically policymakers in Citrus County and Crystal River in that Kings Bay area. Oh yeah, I forgot. So over in there is Kings Bay, like all this messy area. I don't know if you can see my mouse with the way I have this set up, but that's Kings Bay, which is kind of this Bay area in there. But we wanted to ask them about their mental models. How does this work? How does climate change work in mind? And so we went to policymakers. And so this is one policymaker's conception of how climate change worked. You can infer perhaps some of this policymaker's political beliefs, but that's not relevant. And this was this. I raised the idea of climate change, which is why that is in gray. I said, "What do you think about climate change? What causes climate change?" And his response was God causes climate change. Okay, are there, and then you sort of follow up, you try to probe, and so I do a probing thing. Are there other causes of climate change, or is it that? And so it's primarily God. Okay, and what are the effects of climate change? And so the effects are severe weather extremes, melting ice caps, and drought. And again, this was back when I was doing my dissertation, so this is not the latest and greatest, but the themes that I'm going to talk about, I promise you, are still relevant. And drought. We said, okay, that's a pretty limited model of climate change, right? That's not a nuanced understanding of climate change. And within there, there's also not a lot of room for stuff you can do about climate change in there. But we didn't want to just have a 2-minute interview with these people and leave. And so we also asked them about water quality in Kings Bay. What do you know about water quality in Kings Bay? And so the same deal. This is was this the exact same person? I believe it was. Water quality in Kings Bay. Well, what do we know about it? We know the water quality is going down, as you can see in the center. And we know that is going to lead to reduced ecotourism and aquatic recreation, which will cause economic harm. It'll also lead to property values declines, which will cause economic harm. What's causing the water quality? Well, it's fertilizer, it's manatee waste, it's aquatic vegetation. I don't know how much manatee poop actually, but whatever. Aquatic vegetation changes, septic tanks, it's a big problem over there, development. And then if you say, well, manatee waste, what's causing that? It's the manatee population increases. And coastal flooding is leading to that because the manatees, I guess, can come in. Again, I'm not vouching for the veracity of this. We're not trying to understand the truth. We're trying to understand the perspective. Hurricanes. So this is a much more nuanced understanding of like Crystal River and Kings Bay water quality issues than of a different environmental issue, right? Which is climate change. And so that's interesting to me. And so here there's a lot more that if you're in outreach, if you're in extension, if you're in communication, that you can work with. And so what we did here was we just made sort of this big meta map of everything. And we, the gray stuff is stuff that we brought up, and the other stuff is stuff that they mentioned kind of on their own. And so you see that this is a lot more nuanced here, and you can go in and zoom in on different parts. The numbers are how many times we were mentioned. We interviewed 8 people, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a small town with we got a mayor and a handful of city council members. So we spoke to most of them. So you see how often this stuff was mentioned. I'm sorry, I said that. Yeah, but anyway, and so as you can see, there's a lot more stuff to work in here than there is with climate change. But the funny thing is, like when you're looking at all this, so the climate change was mentioned a lot less, but the funny thing is, like, there's a lot of climate change effects in here, right? There's a lot of things that are potential climate change adaptation in here. And so, there's a lot of things that are relevant to the policymakers in there that have nothing to do with the controversy related to climate change. Yeah, and Liz points out that that was heavy on anything having to do with money and impact on property. And you know why? That's Florida, right? And in Florida, especially coastal Florida, that is a very property and tourism oriented area. But money is pretty universal, right? In that movie, oh gosh, what was that movie? I can't remember. But Danny DeVito's character says, "Of course they need money. That's why they call it money," and that's pretty universal, right? Is it Heist? The movie's called Heist. That was an old one. It has profanity, so I can't play the clip. But anyway, the point is, yeah, it's really relevant. So we went from something that, boy, is not relevant. I have a feeling God is fairly relevant, but there's not a lot you can't adapt to God on a societal scale, right? And so we found all these things that were relevant. And yes, it very often rotates around money, and that is not unique to Florida, right? Okay, but then the other thing that matters is not just the message. So let's talk about things that are relevant, but who's doing the talking, right? And this is more relevant. I'm not going to get into my current research because it's less climate related, but really now I'm delving into a lot of what drives trust in messages and messengers. And so maybe I'll come back in a few years and we'll have something to talk about with that. But so this is back to the UTU project. And so we asked farmers, who do you go to for information about your farms, about climate stuff, about weather stuff? I don't remember the exact question. Um, and they said by far it was chemical dealers, right? Those are crop advisors, not chemical dealers like the good stuff. But those are people who are crop advisors or work for chemical or seed companies. Family is really important. Seed dealers, other farmers. Way down that list was university extension. Doesn't mean they're not important, but they're not as relevant as all of these other people, right? State climatologists, non-farming friends, conservation NGOs, they're all way down there. Um, and thank you for that, Valerie. That's kind. All right. But so we asked them who is important, and so this we didn't ask about the trust in this question, but we just asked who are the influential people, and there we go. So Jay is saying, Jay Arbuckle, who does this every year, shows in Iowa that Extension is the most trusted source of climate change info. And that is good. And here's the second part that I want to get into is when we asked ag advisors who they go to for info about climate change. That's where all of a sudden extensions and scientists become really, really important, right? And so Jay's got the latest research in Iowa saying that when it comes to climate change specifically, that is really, really, extension is really, really important, which is why you're out there. And I would argue that that's because you're a known messenger, right? You are a person. You are not an IPCC. You are not a coastal elite. You are a human being who they know and who works with them. And that's really important. But extension and scientists are really important to these farmers' advisors. So to the extent that farm advisors are important when it comes to farm management, extension and scientists are important to those other people. So you've got to think about your message and your messenger and who you're talking to. That, I think, is the critical take home from my little section of the greater UTU project. And so that's on this graph here, just so you can see what it means. The green and blue is trust on the right side. On the left is orange and red. Those are distrust and strongly distrust. And these are actual counts. These are not frequencies. And so you see that most people said they trust or distrust or strongly trust extension and scientists. And the ones that have more red and orange are the ones where more people distrust them. And so that is what is there. And Seagrant's known this, just like y'all have known this. Look at this. This is 2012. This is old. This is old. I don't know any of these people. I know Spencer Rogers, I guess, and I've worked with a lot of Sea Grant programs, but they said the same things. Many coastal adaptation actions appropriate for long-term planning are identical to those employed to manage or mitigate severe, more immediate impacts of other coastal hazards. If Sea Grant is to effectively present adaptation options, it should be recognized. You should recognize that the most convincing reason should be taken, right? And that's often less compelling, or there might be other justifications that are less compelling, and you want to ignore those, right? So the way I phrase it is think about what's relevant to people, think about what's meaningful to people, and talk about that. So like when you look at this, here we go. I think this is from the Sea Grant Photo Library. Yeah, I see a climate adaptation there. I see, the house is lifted on stilts, right? I see about, Sadie has a question which I will come to, and Sadie, I'm going to talk around it and then get back to you. But let me finish this here. So I see a house on stilts. I see adaptation, right? I see insurance savings. I see that house lasting longer into the future if the river, tends to expand or if it tends to erode, right? That is something for your children potentially. There's a lot of different things that you can see there. And so that is important, I think, to remember. So now, oh yeah, all that, I just said that. All right, and I'll leave this up. This is something John McCain used to talk this way in the 2004 election, and I think that this is really, really important. So Sadie asks, Were you able to learn a bit about why people go with the advisors? Sadie, I have speculation, and my speculation is it has to do with the advisors tend to be better educated. Many of them have college degrees, if not graduate degrees, and so it is, so the people who are more salient to them tend to be at universities, or some of the people at universities tend to be more salient to the advisors. This is a guess. That is a hypothesis that would be interesting to investigate. And I can get into what I think of. Well, I didn't come up with this, but this theory that I really like called trust ecology, and sort of the four different types of trust, or four different dimensions of trust, if we have time at the end. And I can wildly speculate, which I really love to do. So if we want to do that at the end, remind me, and I will do it. If we don't have time, then we can wildly speculate over a beer or coffee, depending on which you prefer. Okay. Oh, there's my kid. She was younger than. So, but the point is, harness the power of interest and the power of leverage, right? And this is sort of a co-benefits approach, right? Look at the multiple benefits of different approaches to climate change adaptation, because it can help you hit your target, or at least not miss, right? And that's kind of the key point. All right. And now for something completely different. So we're going to take a little refresher. And speaking of dated, this is a very dated reference. We're going to shift over to something that I'm working on right now. That's stuff that is not hot off the presses, but I think is universal in theme, even if the details change over time. The basics don't. And so that is this thing: the role of boundary organizations in addressing climate-induced human mobility and migration. So when I say boundary organizations, thumbs up in the chat if that is a meaningful term to you, or is that gobbledygook? I see nothing in the chat, which means you have all fallen asleep. Oh, I see. I see some gobbledygook. Oh, I got it. All right, I will give the brief overview. I would love a definition. Okay. Fantastic. Yeah, you see, I am here in my ivory tower. I tried to do this talk from my office and my house, but with all this wind, power is blinking in and out, and so I came back to the ivory tower, where now I sit. I forgot my vest with the patches, or my blazer, but that's okay. Boundary organization. It's essentially, you have scientists, right? And you have the rest of the world and policy, and you have this interface between science and policy. And you have interfaces also between scientists in the real world and policy in the real world. And so in there is like a boundary, right? Where these things maybe overlap, maybe they don't. And the idea is with boundary organizations is these are people who work between these different pillars of sort of public life, right? And try to help these organizations talk to each other, try to help these organizations get each other's, speak the same language as each other. And Jennifer points out very correctly, Jennifer, I apologize, Dindinger, if I got that wrong. She points out extension is a classic boundary organization in my mind, right? Sea Grant, which is often part of extension, often not. There are 34 Sea Grant programs that all work differently, are boundary organizations. The idea is people who help these groups talk to each other and make sense to each other, and help these groups work with each other. Those are boundary organizations. Now, there's a whole literature. And if a boundary organization scientist is on here, they're doing this right into the chat, or they're firing off an email and telling me all the things and you're right, I'm wrong, but this is the gist. I'd rather be roughly right than precisely wrong. So this is the roughly right definition of what a boundary organization is. And so here I'm referring to something, a grant we have going on now with a horribly pixelated logo, Mona, oh my goodness, called People on the Move in a Changing Climate. So this is something, Carolyn says that, Wisconsin creates a very strong boundary organization called the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts in 2009-ish. It's still going pretty strongly. That's fantastic. I'll have to check that out. Anyway, so thanks for these slides to Mona Bell at the University of Georgia and Kathy Bunting-Howarth at Cornell. They both work with Sea Grant and those universities, and they led up this grant and this workshop, and I stole these slides from them. I borrowed their slides to use, but that with permission. So I guess it's not stealing. Anyway, the point is this. What do we know? People are going to move in a changing climate. We know people are going to be moving because of climate change, right? And we met with a lot of scientists who work on this, and people are going to start to move, not necessarily because their house is literally washed to sea, although there will be some of that, but because it's going to become increasingly inconvenient to live in certain coastal areas, right? I'm from New Orleans, and I read one study that basically within 100 years, all of New Orleans and all of Houston, where I also lived, will be in Austin, right? And like in Charleston, my sister lives in Charleston, South Carolina, and they get street flooding just due to the king tides on a very regular basis. And so people are going to start to move, to migrate away from that, because that's not pleasant, right? That's not a comfortable way to live your life. Not everybody will start to move, but people will. And there's this idea out there, very likely to the Great Lakes region, right? The part I was working on is Great Lakes related, but to the Midwest. Why? Because our weather, which used to stink here, is kind of getting kind of good, right? I mean, this winter is terrifyingly warm, but it was not bad. So it's and you know, the areas here is cheap compared to coastal areas a lot of times. So people are going to be moving inland potentially. At least that's something that has been posited. We'll see. But in the meantime, red tide. Ah, yes, red tide in Florida. Exactly. It's a wonderful place to go as long as you don't choke on the toxic algae. But of course, Lake Erie has similar problems, but whatever. And so, yeah, so what do we need to do to prepare? Who do we need to engage? Who do we need to motivate? This is sort of the driving question behind this PMOC, or People on the Move in a Changing Climate project, was to start using the broader Sea Grant network to facilitate this conversation. But first, I'm going to share one of my favorite panels from a comic. I don't even know what comic it's from. I only saw this on social media. And so I'll give you a second to read it. You can all have a chortle, or maybe not. Maybe you just think it's weird, and that's fine too. Good. And so the reason I bring this up is that everybody has like different abilities, right? Everybody has different responsibilities, and everybody has different things that they want to do. And with a problem as complicated as climate change, bringing all of this together is a real challenge. It's really hard. It's not going to happen on its own, right? And so this model of one person doing what they want to do doesn't work for adapting to climate change. It's not going to happen that way. It can't. And so we're trying to figure out what can we do. So we put together, I don't know why I made all these things italics. It made sense at the time, but now I don't get it. But so resource coordinated network, that was the opportunity. But the idea is we're networking people together. We're not having one person with the power to turn people into dinosaurs or whatever, cure cancer. We're having groups of people networking together, more like Avengers. I've never actually seen any Avengers, but I think it's like that. It's facilitated by the Sea Grant Network. I guess I highlighted it because, hey, network 2 times in a row. Here's the Sea Grant Network. If you don't know, there are 34 programs. Every coastal and Great Lakes state has one. There's one in Guam. There's one in Hawaii is a coastal state, I suppose. There's one in Puerto Rico. They're working on one in American Samoa, I think, and next will be the Marianas Islands, I suppose. And we're going to host a series of regional workshops. And that I highlighted because we put people to work during this workshop, which I thought was great. And so we had those in the Great Lakes, the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, the South Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, Southwest, which I think is just about to happen, and the Northwest and International. That was up in Alaska. And so we held these workshops, and we just invited a ton of people to start talking about this. And so the idea is we want to work together to align incentives, or to find out how we might align incentives, how we might pool our abilities, how we might pool our resources, right? And so we invited people. And so I'm going to talk about the one in Buffalo. Now, here's the thing about the one in Buffalo was I didn't take any pictures. So I have like some stand-in pictures. So this is a buffalo. That's not actually the city of Buffalo. That's an animal called a buffalo. And this is the one picture I got. You can see me back there taking a sip from my water, and there's Kathy. There were about 50 or 60 people there. So this is not everybody that was in the room. And this is the other picture I got. I got a selfie of me at Niagara Falls. Great job, Stuart. Okay. And so the people that we invited were scientists, policymakers, planners, and local government. And this was really important, was we invited everybody, right? Trying to work that boundary. These are people that have a lot of boundaries. And so we wanted to start trying to work it in 2 directions, right? Or multiple directions. We're not trying to say, this is not, a boundary organization is not a bunch of academics working with extension to find out what they need to do, or, to find out what information they can get from the populace, from the, to finish up their grants, right? If a boundary organization is facilitating 2-way conversations. And so look, I'm not gonna make you read all this junk because we're getting a little bit late and there's a lot of stuff on there. I'm gonna give kind of the highlights and then we'll take questions. And then this report is almost done, and I'll send this around and you can look at the report. And if you want to talk about it sometime, that's great. I'm happy to talk about it. But right now we have all the information back out to these people because we want to make sure that they agree with our summary of it. That's part of the work of doing boundary work, is making sure that your interpretation makes sense. But what we did was we brought all these people together for a 3-day workshop in Buffalo. And it was the first in-person thing I'd done since COVID. And it was really super, really super. And the goals were this: we wanted to figure out what is the current state of knowledge on climate-induced human mobility. We wanted some local, regional, and international case studies. Here we're talking mainly locally and regionally. But overall, with the overall workshops, we're trying to pull together some international things as well. And we really wanted to focus on underserved and underrepresented coastal communities, right? Because the people I talked about moving because king tide is inconvenient for them. That's a different class of person than the people who get displaced because they can't afford to do anything else, right? Which doesn't mean that the people who are moving because king tide is inconvenient or stinks have unlimited resources, but it's just, or that means that it's easy for them, right? But it's just different types of people, different levels of social and political capital have different needs, and we wanted to try to work on underserved and underrepresented. So here's where you can tell I started stealing slides. Thank you, Kathy at New York Sea Grant and Cornell. We held this in Buffalo last summer. Here's the lead team. I was on there with a lot of other people, and that's great. 50 participants roughly across the Great Lakes. And again, we all came in. And what did we do? Well, we developed a fact sheet for pre-reading. We said, here's what we know about climate impacts in the Great Lakes. And we can send that fact sheet around. If Hans sends me an email, I'll try to find it. We had an opening talk by storyteller. That was cool. This woman, Rachel Haverlock at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's an English prof, but she deals in like people's relationships with water, and she does recordings and stuff like that. It's really cool, really neat. And so I really loved hearing her talk. And I spoke with her, on Teach Me About the Great Lakes, which is the podcast I do. And I was like, you've got to come to this workshop. So she set the stage. And then we had panels, case studies of communities addressing climate change. And we had people from Ann Arbor, a really dynamic woman from Ann Arbor, but people from smaller communities as well, smaller, less liberal communities, talking about what they're doing, what do they need, and that sort of stuff. And then notes from the field. This is really great. Rachel Haverlock, I will post her at the end. If you remind me, I'll post her name in there, and I will post a shameless plug to her appearance on my podcast, because I'm a white guy. That means in the pandemic, I must have a podcast, and I do. And so 3 other breakouts related to this. So the main work, that was the breakout rooms where we reacted to all of these things. The research, solid question, Scott. I'm not going to repeat it, but it's a good question. All right, 3 other breakouts for reacting to all of this. And the breakouts we split out by researchers, education, and outreach and policy. There's plenty of time for cross-pollination, of course, but we broke out the rooms. And so here are the conclusions. I'm not going to read these 2 because you can A, read the slides yourself, B, they're a little bit preliminary while we finalize the report, and C, there's a lot of them and we're running low on time. But instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about this process. Well, I'll talk about the implications for future work. One is, we got to think about migration, right? This is something that a lot of and I'll talk about my overall take on it that I think is very important in a minute. DEIJ issues are top of mind for participants in both regions. Kathy was presenting on the Northeast as well, but no, this came up a lot. People are very much thinking about it. Resources for focused follow-up. This is my hobby horse, is I'm very, very afraid that we get this cool NSF grant and we go out into communities of researchers and policymakers and outreach people, and we say, hey, what do we need? And then we go back and we write our report and nothing ever happens again, right? That happens all the time when we work in communities. That's one of the challenges of working with underserved communities, and some of the work I do in resilience is like, how do we convince them and follow up on that we're not just trying to get our grant deliverables, right? How do we do something meaningful? I'm really worried that without follow-up stuff, we're gonna do the same dang thing with the scientists and the policymakers and the local, we're like, hey, thank you, see you later. So we need to find resources for follow-up. It's critical. And networking is important. These conversations have got to happen. And then we got to think about, what goes differently by each, in each region. And that's good. But the high level meta summary is what I want to give you and that is this: there's substantial barriers right now to working across these industries, these fields. I don't know what the right word was. The timelines are different. Communities want to know now what's happening. Scientists want to know, aren't always comfortable saying what is going to happen or what is going to happen specifically at a given. That's not how science works. Science is like, you're trying to quantify uncertainty, but uncertainty is there. But if you're talking to somebody who works for like the city of, Duluth, Minnesota or whatever, she wants to know how many people she's going to get and when she's going to get them, right? The language is different. I don't mean literally, sometimes literally the language, English versus Spanish versus Polish or, whatever, but just the way people talk about things, the incentives are different. What scientists are looking for are different from what other people are looking for. That's a big high level matter. And like, in all honesty, we're on step like 0.5, I think, on this. We're not on step 1. We're not on step, we're certainly, if it's a 10-step process, yeah, we're on step 0.5. We need to have a lot more of these conversations, but we also need to take action. We need to keep doing this, right? But there's, at some point, conversation has to lead to something. And how do we make that happen? I don't know, but we need to think about that. Oh, another thing, paying money helps. We paid those people to be there. We didn't pay them a lot because, right, we're humble public servants, but we paid for their travel and gave them a small stipend. We paid for some of their travel, and that made a big difference. Everybody's, we got 15 faculty members to come to a 3-day workshop. That's not typical. We got people to come from NGOs, small NGOs, and everywhere, and that's not typical. And we did. It's because of the stipend that they were able to do it. And I think there's excitement around this topic. It's an important topic, but I just, that little meta note, I wanted to point out that if you're doing this stuff, if you can, pay people, it makes a difference. And when you're talking about large grants, it's kind of a pittance compared to the overall grant value, but you got to remember to put it in. Okay, so what does all this mean? Oh wait, Sadie had a comment. Thank you for this, Sadie. We already have such a tough challenge with NIMBY. Does anyone have a hopeful approach to preparing for migrations in terms of local acceptance? Boy, yeah, that is a hornet's nest. And I don't have a pithy answer to that, Sadie, to tell you the truth. I think it is a very big concern, right? Especially, yeah, I'm not going to step into that right now. But yes, it is a concern, and the political differences, in terms of the ways that people think about different types of communities makes a big difference, right? I was going to allude to the fact that you saw people migrating to the U.S. getting shipped off to other areas from Texas and Florida, but we don't need to get into all the details of that, and we don't need to have a conversation about it because, again, I'm a humble public servant. But I think that what you can draw from that is that people view just basic human beings very differently. And they view the value of people very differently. And again, going back to how hard it is to change my hearts and minds, right? That's a constraint that I think we have to work with. But that's a different webinar. That's not this webinar. This webinar is a little dude scratching his head. And so 3 big conclusions. I'm actually just repeating the same 3 big conclusions, but I think it's important. And so there are a diversity of viewpoints on climate change actions. Crystal has a great question that I will come to. There are a diversity of viewpoints on climate change, right? And again, this is not going to change. What they things shift, but they don't shift fast. These views are relatively, that's what I just said, thank you, me. These views are relatively resistant to change, at least in the short run. And one approach is to work with people's beliefs, not against them. But it's easy to say, let's do co-benefits. Let's talk about water quality instead. But finding those issues in every single little place is hard, and finding ways to do that is hard. But the thing is, this isn't easy, right? It's not easy. But if this is the big 4th conclusion, it doesn't happen unless we make it happen. These conversations don't occur. And this goes to Crystal's thoughts about what thoughts do you have on the role of boundary organizations in coming up with action steps. We find the convening easy, but need more buy-in for action. He's totally right. The thing is, I think boundary organizations are I'm not going to say a secret to doing this, because they can have that focus on making this happen. But moving from awareness to action is not easy. I completely agree with that. But boundary organizations can make that part of their mission, which is much harder for a scientist to do or a policymaker to do. And so by helping to keep people talking and helping to move the ball, I think that's how you can do it. And but I think that's very easy to say. Find your spouner, says Jody. Thank you, Jody, for that. There are people who work across the boundary and between the boundaries. Those people are critical. When I say advocates, I don't mean that they take a one-sided view of things. I mean people who can advocate for going between the boundaries are really important. After hurricanes, for example, this is related but not the same thing. We found that communities that recover, I didn't find this, but someone I worked with, Kathy Garland at the University of Houston in Clear Lake, found that communities that have somebody to work between the response apparatus and the community, they have those advocates, they have those people speaking for them, are much more likely to recover quickly than our other communities, because those people. So people make a difference. This is a societal problem where there's an opportunity for thousands upon thousands of individuals to make a difference. But if they aren't there, then we're waiting for technology, in my opinion. And Sadie pointed out, yes, moving from education to action, the community-based social marketing model is a good one to start with. And there's a lot to be done there, especially on changing individual small steps, right? But individual small steps are important. They can lead to larger behaviors, or enough individual small steps can lead to larger change. But yeah, the critical point is it doesn't happen unless you make it happen, because inertia isn't the inertia is, for the climate inertia is going up and to the right, hotter and longer. And the human inertia, it's harder to get a read. You can't summarize that, but inertia is a tough beast. So that was my big broad conclusion. This was a lot. I don't know if any of it made sense if you're still there. But send me an email and we can continue to talk about this. I think that is my last slide. Yeah. Oh, it is. Oh, so they all went away. Okay, cool.
So Stuart has done an excellent job of monitoring the chat himself. So I'm sure he's going to continue to do so. If you would like to enter anything else into the chat, the poll has 2 questions and it's now available. If it's possible for you to complete that, really appreciate it. I'll leave it up for a couple of minutes.
Hello to Karen Bareford, my old colleague, and Jay, my old colleague. They're coming out of the woodwork. It's great to see both of y'all virtually. So Brian, misread. Brian Kirwan says it is hard to inspire change where there's great variability and potential changes. Yeah, lots of discussions of changes at 8.5, I assume you mean degrees, right? Not so many at 1.5 degrees Celsius of average warming. You are correct. Yeah, it's really hard, right? And looking at the spectrum of what's out there, the gradient of what's out there makes it really tough. It's hard to make this urgent for people. And, our drought thing showed that the weather might not do it. But again, 10 years of weather might do it. But people got a lot on their mind and a lot of things that are much more urgent. So I hear you. It is hard to inspire change. I don't disagree at all. And I think that that's where working with people who are committed sort of in these large organizations can make a difference. Mark Megalos says, excellent presentation. Did I do that without Adderall? I think much of the issues in my life can be explained about the lack of Adderall. So I need to converse with people about that, but that's a different conversation to have. Yeah, this is me without the meds. Cool. Thank you everybody for coming. If you have more questions or anything you want to chat about, or if you want to push back on something, please do. I don't mind disagreement. Oh, I said I'd mention Rachel's name. Yeah, let me find her info. Hold on. Rachel Havrlock. Here she is. And her group is called the Freshwater Lab, I think. Go to freshwaterstories.com for some of her stuff. There's her thing. And yeah, I don't actually have her on the Teach Me About the Great Lakes, but just go to teachmeaboutthegreatlakes.com if you want to listen. I mean, more of this nonsense and hear what she has to say. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Linda Keene says, I'm participating in the EU Energy Earthshot, which parallels these activities. I continue to seek out these activities in the US. She leads a STEAM by Design e-learning nonprofit that introduces the built and natural world together. Oh, we publish water, food, energy journals to tie them together. Very cool. Water bar for storytelling. Thank you for that, Sadie. So Linda, is there a website where we can learn more about that?
We also had somebody want to know what your podcast is and where to find it.
Oh, sorry. Yes, stealth marketing. You don't have to, but yeah, it's teachmeaboutthegreatlakes.com. I'm firing it up right there. It's the stupid shtick is thank you, Linda, for that next.cc, where I ask people who are smarter and harder working than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. That's that one. And the one where our live stream, you can find it askdrfish.com. And if you're going to be at the International Association for Great Lakes Conference, which clearly most of you will be, you can see us live there. It'll be super fun. It's more of this goofiness, and so I apologize for that in advance. Cool. Other questions or concerns? NextCC STEAM by Design used in 50 states and 200 countries. Everyone needs to know about what's going on. I agree. I'm going to check it out. Let's check it out. All right, farmers and rural folks are seeing the climate change. They're seeing flooding gullies in place. Yeah, this is an interesting point. That awareness is a good place to start the conversation, says Daniel Zur. So I was working, I won't say who it was. It was someone on the project team just because he said it in confidence. Or not in confidence, but he said it, not in a public place. And this is a public employee, and so I don't want to, but someone at one point, we were talking about we did focus groups all across the Midwest. And he said, it's fascinating to hear these farmers, some of the farmers, it's not everybody, of course, but to hear the farmers talking about adapting to the climate change that they don't believe in. And I was like, yeah, that is an interesting way of phrasing it. But I think what Daniel's pointing to is, I think that focusing instead on what you're talking about is much more important. I tend to be very middle of the road when it comes to issues. I think it's finding agreement is very powerful. And leaning into disagreement tends to be challenging. And so in the types of jobs that we're in, where we're so, there's a role for advocacy. I'm not saying there is not, but I'm saying in our jobs as people who either work on boundaries, work with the public, looking for that area of agreement is much more powerful, much easier, and likely to be much more successful, in my opinion.
Okay, we're just about to the top of the hour, so I think we're going to go ahead and call it there. Of course, if you have questions, maybe Stuart can stick around for a couple minutes, but we're going to go ahead and end the recording, and feel free to take off. Our next webinar is going to be in April, and it's going to feature, we really, really hope, Marilyn Thalen, who recently retired from Michigan State University Extension, with kind of a recap of her career and other insights she'd like to share. So with that, have a great day, everybody.